Thank you very much. Good evening. It is a real pleasure to be here. I just flew in from San Francisco, where I'm pleased to say we won the World Series. So that gave a good start to the day. But I'm here to talk about this idea of creating shared value that Michael Porter and I wrote about maybe 3.5 years ago now. And that idea has had an amazing resonance around the world, much more than we ever expected. And in fact, the idea is becoming a movement. And that's very exciting to us. And I have to say, I'm particularly pleased to be in Denmark, because Denmark has been way ahead. Close to 10 years ago now, when Michael and I wrote a much earlier article on strategy and society, the government of Denmark reached out to us and said, help us think about how to apply these concepts to the small businesses that make up the majority of employment in Denmark. And we did a wonderful project with the government, thinking through how small businesses can engage with these ideas to really improve the context in which they operate, to improve the society in which they operate in ways that strengthen their competitiveness. But let me take a minute and talk to you about why this idea of creating shared value is so important to me personally. I came across an interesting statistic just this week. Tokyo and New York City both have just hit the peak in the number of homeless people. In Tokyo, it's 1,697. In New York City, it's 56,000. I spent many years working with foundations and in philanthropy. And the U.S. is very proud of its nonprofit sector. And in fact, people in the U.S. give, on average, 3 times as much per capita to charity as any other country. And yet, when you look at the social issues that the nonprofit sector is supposed to be solving, they don't work. That number of homelessness in New York City is typical of the kinds of problems that the U.S. is facing and is unable to combat through charity and the nonprofit sector. We have 1.5 million nonprofit organizations, each doing their own thing in their own way, without any coordination. And the result is, on almost every measure, from educational attainment to early childhood mortality to the environment, the U.S. ranks toward the bottom of the OECD countries. And yet I see around the world, in China, in India, in South Africa, other countries trying to copy the U.S. model of philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. And I travel around the world saying, don't do that. It isn't going to solve social problems. And one of the reasons I think it doesn't work is because it leaves companies out of the equation. And to me, that is what is so powerful about this idea of creating shared value. I want to be very clear that shared value does not compete with corporate social responsibility. And it does not compete with philanthropy. It builds on those two worlds. It builds on all of the terrific work that has been done on sustainability. But it takes it in a slightly different direction. In the last decade, there has been a shift in thinking about the role of business in solving social problems. You can look at the many CSR and sustainability efforts from 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they're all about reducing the harm that business causes in its operations. And that's important. But what has shifted in the last decade is to begin to think about what good business can do to actually use the tools at its disposal to help solve social problems. That business is not just the problem, but can become a key element of the solution. And when you engage business, not as a philanthropist, not for public relations, but the core operations of the company, you get a degree of innovation, you get a degree of efficiency, you get a scale of impact that the nonprofit sector doesn't have, that in many ways government does not have the freedom to achieve. And when you're able to solve a problem with a market-driven solution, a profit-making solution, it can be sustained and scaled without needing subsidy, without needing donations, without needing tax revenue. It becomes tremendously powerful. And so we've seen movements around social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, B corporations, impact investing. What all of these have in common, and they've all come up in the last few years, is the idea that you can make money by solving social problems. And that is a legitimate role for business to play. And that really is the essence of creating shared value. The idea that companies can treat social issues as business opportunities, and that companies have a role to play alongside government, alongside NGOs, in actually helping to achieve social change. And let me give you just two quick examples. Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, has had a successful operation for many years selling its medicines in India. It sells them in the major cities where there is a healthcare infrastructure. There are doctors, there are hospitals, there are pharmacies. But 70% of the population lives in rural villages, very poor, and still practicing traditional Ayurvedic medicine, not in touch with modern medicine. Now, one can have great respect for traditional medicine, but sometimes traditional medicine gets it wrong. For example, when someone has diarrhea, the Ayurvedic treatment is to say there's an excess of fluid in the body, so this person should not drink anything. Now, we know when children die, when people die from diarrhea, it's because of dehydration. The most urgent thing is for them to drink. So Novartis said, maybe we can create a business selling our medicines in these rural villages. But to do that, there's no distribution system, there's no educated, trained healthcare workers, and indeed the population needs to be educated in basic healthy behavior. And so they hired 300 women from these villages and trained them to become healthcare educators. They were not salespeople, but they went back into the villages and they gave little shows with illustration pictures to try and explain the idea of recognizing symptoms, of going to get treatment, of taking medicine. They had to develop a completely new distribution system to get the medicines out to these regions that were remote. But today, Novartis is able to sell its medicines profitably to 80 million people who had no access to it before. And there's a really interesting contrast because in one of the states in India where they operate, the government had a few years ago implemented a very expensive program to bring treatment for diabetes into this state. And they'd spent a lot of money, and it had failed completely because they hadn't actually brought in people like the healthcare educators to teach the population how to think about and behave toward these therapies. That's the other thing about business. When business tackles a problem, they're not satisfied unless the solution actually works. Government and philanthropy are filled with examples of great ideas, of things that people ought to do, things that would be good for people, things that make rational sense, that don't actually get adopted because that's not how people really behave. The fact that something's good for you doesn't mean you'll do it. But when companies focus on things, they focus not on what would be nice, what would be good, but on what actually works. Let me give you one other example, and this is from a company, Nestle, and it's in Africa. Nestle sells lots of food products. Not all of them are good for you, candy bars, so on. Controversial company in many ways. But they've decided that part of their future growth opportunity is going to be making products that meet specific nutritional needs. And so they went to the World Health Organization and they said, we're selling products in Western Africa. What are the specific nutritional deficiencies? Well, it turns out that a majority of children have deficiencies in iron and vitamin A. A substantial percentage of women do too. It leads to ill health. It leads to stunting in children, which retards not only their physical growth, but their mental development as well. So Nestle said, okay, let's figure out if there's a product we can develop that would meet this need. And they sent anthropologists out into 1,500 homes of low-income families in the region to see how the families actually prepared their meals, what they bought, how they used their very limited budget, what they chose to cook with, how they served the food. And Nestle came up with the idea of selling a small bouillon cube, a soup cube, a spice cube, that had the necessary nutrients in it, that could be sold for a fraction of a cent, just a couple rupees, and that met the taste preferences of people in that region. They're selling 90 million a day. They're having an impact on hundreds of millions of people through these families, improving nutrition, and they're making money doing it. So when we talk about companies innovating and addressing social issues at scale, those are the kinds of examples that so inspire me. And they're different from CSR, they're different from sustainability. They're not about what the company is doing in its day-to-day usual operations. They're about new growth opportunities, new ways of doing business that can reach populations that weren't served before, that can create new products that meet social needs, that can strengthen the communities in which the companies operate in ways that contribute to their competitive advantage. That's the idea of creating shared value. Michael and I have also learned that when he and I talk about the idea of creating shared value, we also have to say what we do not mean, because people sometimes confuse what the words are intended to mean. So we're not talking about sharing value that's already been created. That's philanthropy. And we're not talking about shared values with an S, not personal values. It's very important that the people who lead our companies have sound personal values. But that's not the kind of value we're talking about. We're really talking about creating new economic value and new social impact through the innovations that business can create. And when we talk about creating shared value, we talk about it happening at three different levels. The first level is around new products and markets. And so the example I described of Nestle is about creating a new product that meets a social need at scale profitably. But I was also delighted driving in this afternoon from Billund to see all of the wind turbines alongside the road here. And there are companies that are making money having developed new and better technologies for wind turbines. And that's another example. And a third example, and I have to say one of my favorites, is a company I came across when I was in South Africa. And it's a company called Discovery Health Insurance. And it's about a 10-year-old company, very successful. The idea behind the company was that we could be a more profitable health insurance company if we could get people to be healthier. And it is basic things like your diet, whether you smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, and whether you exercise, basic things like that, that are the biggest determinants of your health and therefore the cost of your health care. So this insurance company said, maybe we can use behavioral economics to persuade people to adopt healthier behaviors. So you pay your health insurance premium, and they'll pay for your health club membership, but only if you go twice a week. If you stop going, they stop paying. And when you go to the grocery store, you give a card at checkout, and your bank account will automatically be reimbursed for 25% of whatever you spend on fruit and vegetables. But only those things. And they have a whole set of incentives for healthy behavior, and they have found that their insured population, they're now the biggest health insurer in South Africa, their insured population has a longer life expectancy, gets sick less often. When they're sick, they recover more quickly. And the insurance company, even after paying these incentives, is still more profitable than any of the other insurance companies. They've recently branched out into auto insurance. And they've said, if you let us, we'll put a device in your car that actually tracks your driving behavior. And we'll tell you how you're doing, and if you're a good driver, you'll get points. And if you get enough points, we'll start paying half of your gasoline bill every month. They can watch, over the first 6 months, people's driving improve. Because, of course, everyone thinks they are an above-average driver. But there's no data that we have to actually confirm or reject that. And so their auto-insured population has half the fatalities from auto accidents of the population at large. This is a company whose entire competitive advantage is rooted in making people healthier and safer and live longer. The amount of money that they are saving the government by reduced health expenses and by reduced auto accidents is a tremendous public benefit. But it is creating a benefit for them and their shareholders. So it's a great example of rethinking the business you're in based on the social issues that are involved. And this is what we're beginning to see, because shared value is ultimately a business strategy. And it is about taking into account social and environmental impacts in your core strategy, not on the periphery. And far too many companies I see out in the world today make their core business decisions, and then off to the side, there are 3 people in a CSR department who are supposed to do something with a little bit of money to make the company look good. So that first level of creating shared value, new products and new markets. The second level is rethinking productivity in your value chain. And there's a great example here in Denmark of Maersk, the shipping company. And they began to focus in on their carbon emissions and fuel usage. And they actually have put in place a whole range of improvements, including redesigning the bow of the ship so that there is less water resistance. And they're now achieving 25% fewer CO2 emissions per shipping container compared to 2007. And they're on track to achieve a 40% reduction by 2020. And in 2012 alone, they saved $1.6 billion in fuel costs because of this shift. Now, every company is trying to cut cost. Every company is trying to maximize its profitability. But until recently, companies were not thinking about the cost of their environmental impacts. And yet we see time and time again that companies are able to save massive amounts of money by rethinking their value chain, by coming up with new ways of doing business that reduce their environmental impact and that reduce the social costs that are associated with their business, and thereby increase their profitability. The third level of creating shared value is around strengthening the community or the cluster, the economic cluster in which the company operates. And there's an interesting thing that Maersk is just beginning to do there too. They've said we've got three prongs to really what is a shared value strategy. The first is this environmental improvement, reducing our CO2 footprint and our fuel usage. The second is improving the skills of workers in the ports where we operate. Now, in Denmark, the workers are very skilled, but Maersk ships to places in Africa and Latin America, all over the world, where there is not a local skilled workforce. And the productivity and the time it takes to unload ships and so on is reduced by, the productivity is reduced, the time is increased by the lack of skilled workers. And so they've said, it makes sense for us to invest in training workers in the vicinity of the ports where we operate. It'll help people earn a better living, give them skills, and it will also reduce our costs and make our operations more efficient. And the third thing that Maersk has said is, our whole business depends on international trade because it's shipping things from one place to another. And there are all kinds of impediments and barriers to the quick and easy movement of goods internationally. All kinds of red tape, government regulations, policies, customs issues. Why don't we focus on trying to change policy to reduce the red tape and to make international trade all over the world more efficient, easier, quicker? Again, a social benefit that is of tremendous benefit to the company. A way of strengthening not just its own operations, but the entire industry of which it's a part. I'll give you one other example. It is a favorite example of mine about strengthening the industry of which you're a part. And that example is Cisco Systems, the networking equipment company. Cisco discovered about 10 years ago now that the biggest constraint on their growth is there weren't enough trained network administrators in the world to support their customers in managing the equipment that Cisco wanted to sell them. Now, Cisco could have said, we're not an education company. It's a problem in the world. It's not our business to deal with it. But instead, they said, there's nobody better than us to train people in network administration. So let's create a distance learning curriculum. It's not going to be a simple curriculum. It's a 2-year-long course. And we'll have to do it with universities, with high schools, with community-based groups, somebody locally, because there needs to be a physical place for people to work on the equipment. But we can do all the testing and see the results in California, and so we can ensure the level of quality of the students is the same, whether they take it in Holtzbro or in Pakistan or in New York City. They've now been operating this program for 10 years. They've trained 4 million people around the world to be network administrators. They've worked with the United Nations to develop special programs for the least developed countries in the world, and to develop special programs in Muslim countries to bring women into technology jobs that they would have no opportunity to get into otherwise. They've worked in the United States in our inner city high schools, which are hugely failing, and given career opportunities to youth who would have dropped out of high school, who would never go to college. They've created billions of dollars in benefits for people who have been through this course and gotten new careers as a result. And they've fundamentally changed conditions in their industry because they were in a great position to solve this social problem, this failure in the world. And there's not a nonprofit organization or a government program that they could have written a check to that could have achieved this kind of impact at this kind of scale with this speed and this quality. They were able to do it because it tapped the core capabilities of their business as a business. And that's why, even though I started out focusing on how to make philanthropy more effective, and FSG, the nonprofit consultancy that I helped run and that Michael Porter and I founded, originally stood for Foundation Strategy Group, because our first thought was we're going to work with big foundations like Gates and Rockefeller to help them improve their strategies. We still do that. But more of our work now, and what really excites me, is working with companies. Because all over the world, we see that companies have had blinders on. They have not thought about the social issues and the environmental impacts that they are having. They've not thought about building a competitive positioning that is rooted in a social value proposition. And so again and again, we see companies discovering new opportunities to grow their business, to increase their profitability, to find new avenues, new populations, new markets to serve, when they begin to think that they can solve social problems by finding the business opportunity that's in them. And so, as I said, this idea is really becoming a movement. And that, I believe, is tremendously exciting. Because for all of the generosity of our donors, and all of the good intentions of government, and all of the hard, selfless work of our NGOs and nonprofits and charities, we are not making the kind of progress we need to make against the urgent issues that face our world. And if we can bring companies to the table, not to blame them for doing wrong, and I want to be clear, companies do wrong. Shared value is not meant to excuse bad behavior on the part of companies. Companies can destroy value as well as create it. We're not trying to greenwash or shared value wash companies. But when you bring companies to the table as an active player doing what they do best, to participate in solving social problems, you can achieve a level of innovation and impact and scale that we have not seen before. And so I hope that you will embrace this idea. I hope that you are beginning to imagine, as you sit here, what your organization might do differently if they really embrace this idea of creating shared value. Because it creates a common agenda, whether you are a an academic. We desperately need the cases, the rigorous research, the measurement tools that enable us to prove the case in industry after industry and social issue after social issue and region after region as to how these opportunities work in practice. That needs to be studied. It needs to be part of the curriculum of business schools. And if you are a government, there's a great deal government can do to promote shared value activities on the part of companies. And government is also a huge purchaser of goods and services, and it can require in its purchasing a shared value element from companies. And if you are working with a nonprofit organization, an NGO, we actually have convened a working group of 10 of the largest NGOs in the world, their CEOs, that are now meeting regularly to think about how do they develop shared value partnerships with companies that aren't just about getting a check, but are about launching new business ventures that are shared by the NGO and the company to address social issues at a scale they couldn't achieve before. And certainly if you're here from a company, I promise you, there are opportunities you haven't yet seen to really build shared value into the core strategy and thinking and competitive positioning of the company. And that the next real opportunity in management strategy, in increased productivity and profitability, comes from embedding this idea of shared value into your company. So I hope I've been able to persuade you, at least a little bit, that shared value builds on sustainability, builds on CSR, but adds something fundamentally new. And that if we can take this idea and build it into a broader global movement, we can see more progress in addressing the urgent issues we face in the coming decades than we have ever seen before. Thank you very much for letting me be here with you today.
Thank you. The time is almost up, but we do have a few moments for just a few questions, so feel free to speak up. Can I ask you,
yes,
in your studies, have you narrowed down what motivates a business into make shared value or creating shared value a core strategy, as you talk about? What's the main motivation?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure there's a single motivation. But one of the things we've seen that's very interesting is CEOs of major global companies who say, I actually want to create a legacy that is more than just having increased the stock price. I need to do that, but I want to create a legacy that's something more. And this is an opportunity to do that. I think we've also seen companies that are in industries that are in transition. I mentioned Novartis, the pharmaceutical company. There's tremendous pricing pressure on pharmaceuticals in the developed world. And so a lot of the growth is going to happen in emerging markets, and they've had to figure out how to deal with these very different circumstances. Another thing we see is that we are told again and again that students coming out of college, students coming out of business school, want to work for companies that have a social purpose. And companies, in order to be able to recruit, are saying we need to figure out how to do this. We need to have a message that talks about not just, again, philanthropy and CSR, but how we are really seriously building this into our business.
Interesting. So this might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience for you, so please raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, we have a question over here. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry.
Okay, I'll begin here then. Hi, I'm Claes Amundsen from Save the Children Denmark.
Yes.
I guess there's a matter of dialogue here also. Of course, a company can hire anthropologists and send them into society and just ask people, what do you need? But what is your general recommendation how a enterprise enters into this dialogue with civil society to find out what is actually the need and how do we move from just win-win to a real common agenda?
Part of it is really researching the social issues in depth. So there are a lot of companies that think about an issue and they think about writing a check or funding a program. But for example, when Nestle thought about these bullion cubes in West Africa, they did a tremendous amount of research and development to develop a product that met the social need but also had popular demand. And they actually work with NGOs in regions of West Africa that are too remote for them to be able to sell the goods profitably. And so they let NGOs do the distribution there. We've seen examples, interesting example, Unilever spent quite a bit of money to develop a waterless toilet. There are about 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to sanitation. And figuring out how to provide a toilet that works in remote conditions is a huge issue. Now, Unilever spent a lot of money to develop it. They didn't want to be in the business of selling toilets. So they actually created a joint venture with an NGO that now sells the product that Unilever created. But Unilever does sell a lot of toilet cleaning equipment and supplies. And so Unilever figures if there are 2 billion more toilets in the world, that's very good for our business. But we don't want to be the ones selling it, so we developed a joint venture with an NGO. There are many other examples where I've seen new business models where NGOs and companies have found out a common opportunity that serves both of their interests and that can make money. But it's not kind of a generic thing. It's really focusing in on the issue. And we've actually worked with Carolyn Miles and at Save the Children internationally. And I know that there are conversations going on, at least, about how Save the Children can find shared value opportunities to work with companies as well.
There's one last question over here.
Yeah, one question. I would like your point of view on the business model from the health insurance company. Do you think that we can copy or use some of it in the Danish public health sector?
Absolutely. So the story of Discovery Insurance is very interesting, and they have expanded. They're actually in the UK, they're in China, they're in the US. In many countries, wellness services, exercise, diet, that kind of thing, are separated from health insurance. So, for example, in the US, they're not a health insurer, they offer just these wellness services. It actually doesn't work as a business model for them. So the health insurance environment is very different from country to country. And in order for their business model to work, the same company that provides the wellness benefits has to be capturing the insurance savings. And so they've seen it's working in Australia, it's working with a different model in China. I'm sure that that can be captured somehow in Denmark, but how it actually works will depend on how insurance is structured here. But, you know, we've interviewed them. We're actually doing an executive education course at Harvard in about a month on shared value. And one of the cases we've written up to study there is this Discovery Health Insurance. And as we've interviewed them and really gotten into the details, it's very clear that in every one of these cultures, as different as China might be from South Africa, from the UK, these same basic determinants, these basic behavioral actions of, you know, substance abuse, exercise, diet, are the things that really determine something like 70 or 80% of your health, of your ultimate health and healthcare costs. And so if you can create the incentives to do this, and actually there's a group in Canada that is doing something similar with air miles. And they give air miles for people for exercise and other beneficial things. So I'm sure there's a model that works here. It's probably not exactly the same as Discovery, but I'm sure there's a model that works here.
That was the last question, I'm sorry. But thank you so much for your tremendous
Thank
work
you.
and your inspiration here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.